Now, Ava has been around for quite some time. That came out of the Highland program in Ontario. And Dynagrow has a line 9242W. I don't know if you guys have grown that, but if you have, your Don levels at the elevator will have been very, very low. So it has good resistance to Don and very, very good resistance to infection by the fungus. So those are two mechanisms of scab resistance. The accumulation of mycotoxin, Don. Now that's where the fungus doesn't produce as much mycotoxin in certain varieties. And the other is resistance in severity. So the fungus can infect a spike, but it doesn't move very far. If a line that has good resistance, that fungus will stay put right at that single floor and won't move. So and that'll reduce your overall Don in every load. So both of those types of resistance are available in white wheat and red wheat. And it's not always a compromise to have high yield potential in a variety and good scab resistance. The highest yielding variety over the last 4 years, it was a Pioneer line, 25R34, was also one of the most scab resistant lines. And those numbers that you see for those lines are going to come out of our scab nursery over there, where we deliberately infect with scab inoculum and promote disease with an optimum wet environment and misting. So this is really as bad as we can make scab. We still have lines that are resistant. Now, that said, the end product, the grain in your field being free of disease and free of Don, is an interaction between the genetic resistance and the management practices that you apply. Now, most varieties, I will say that all varieties require, even at $5 wheat, require a fungicide application at flowering to control scab and get you the highest return on investment. And variety, just as much as people can push management, but variety is just is equally important. And there are varieties out there that will resist Don very, very well. So what Ava 9242, W Pioneer 2534, and our new release from MSU E6012 has very low levels of Don accumulation in the grain. So that's probably one of the most traits of most concern to us. Well, it's always second. Scab always comes second. Yield potential is the number one. That's the most important trait, I believe, for myself and my breeding program and for you as growers. And I really like working in Michigan because Michigan has very high yield potential. Now, we have, in the genetics of the varieties that we have and in the environments where we're growing our varieties, there's very high yield potential here. And that's why I say, there really is good potential. So the biggest impact on yield, though, is environment. Now, environment can mean a lot of different things. And I also like Michigan because you always have a map on your hand. So to talk about different environments. So we have very, very unique environments in southern Michigan, Lenawee County and Ingham County. And the thumb also has 3 very unique environments. So certain varieties are adapted to those production conditions. So southern Michigan is very different from the thumb region in terms of how these varieties perform. And I encourage you, when we produce our variety trial report, excuse me, have a look at the end at the tables for each individual county. And there can be a switch. So the line that wins the trials overall, the overall winner is not always the winner in each of those locations. So it's important to identify lines that perform best closest to where you are, to where your farm is. So that's environment, geographical location, and the rainfall and the nighttime temperatures present there. But environment also means management practices. Basically the nitrogen and the fungicides that you're using to control disease and push yield potential. And I stress that it's an interaction because a short variety like Jupiter here, or Shirley behind you there, those varieties can tolerate that extra yield potential that you're pushing on them with higher nitrogen rates. So there's an interaction with every variety and the management practices that you have. Just like fungicide applications that's part of the environment that you're growing those varieties in. So, and maturity has a lot to do with that. So there are some varieties that flower earlier, and as you can see, those varieties that are flowering earlier usually have higher yield potential. So that extra 1 or 2 days of earliness, that gives you 1 or 2 days of extra grain fill. So that's an advantage. That's a tremendous advantage to have that extra 2 days of grain fill. But you don't want to go too early. I mean, I've seen in my nurseries, I've seen some singed awns there, and that's kind of that's a warning sign right there. Don't go too early. So that said, you can also spread your risk then too. You can combine across multiple days. So lines that flower earlier generally mature earlier. They'll hit physiological maturity and dry down earlier. So if you have 2 varieties set apart by 1 or 2 days, one variety should be ready on one day and another on a second day. So if you have 1,000 acres of wheat to combine, you can split that across 2 days if you have 2 different maturities then. So now I want to emphasize plant height. I brought it up already, but I want to emphasize that there is variation, 7 inches of variation for height, plant height in Michigan wheat varieties. We've got our tallest, Ambassador and AC Mountain, at 37 inches. So they generally tell you can. So there's a saying that you can tell how tall a wheat breeder is by how tall his varieties are. And so I would have a hard time getting this low to select. You might think I developed AC Mountain years ago, but that's not always the case. Actually, Shirley is one of the shortest varieties we have, and Carl Griffey at Virginia Tech is 6'5". So that's the exception that proves the rule. Now, another one is that is like AC Mountain, very, very high yield potential, but a very tall variety. They talk about interaction with management. So if you have a variety that's that tall, you really want to be careful with the amount of nitrogen. If you're going 150 pounds of nitrogen on a tall variety, and there's a windstorm, that could be disastrous. So that's why I stress that we do have available to us very short varieties with very high yield potential. So that's enough me talking. I'd like to talk about the varieties a little bit here. So we've got some contemporary varieties. Come on down if you guys are interested. We're going to start up here and then head down that way. So this variety is looking very good this year. I've had my eye on it. Pioneer 2531. Very short stature. Many heads per area here. It really fills out the canopy very well. So I'm expecting big things from this variety this year. It's a white wheat from Pioneer here. So moving on, we've got Jupiter here. This is from the MSU program. This has been out for several years now, and I keep stressing the interaction between variety and management. Jupiter will yield 30 bushels higher under intensive management. 30 bushels higher. So with a standard urea application, an early fungicide application, 28%, good weed management, and a Prosaro Caramba type product to control scab later on, we'll see up to 30 bushels in yield increase from a variety like Shirley. So, and next to it you see Hopewell. That's an old standby variety. It's beautiful when you drive by. You can see it from the road. The bronze color. If you see bronze from the road, it's probably Hopewell. So, moving on here, we've got a new release. This is soft white wheat. Meets all the quality parameters. Has good down resistance. Very good down resistance for a white wheat. So, and I think it's well adapted to southern Michigan, as well as the thumb. Very stable yield potential. I could probably tell you within a half bushel of certainty what it will yield this year and next year. So. Now, Shirley, I mentioned this before. This is a Virginia Tech variety, very short stature and very high yield potential. So this is the type of variety that you could make that extra investment. You could get a higher return of investment on a short stature variety like that. But this plant architecture is very well adapted to intensive management. Now, moving on. Another component of environment is which year it is. Now, some varieties tend to, I'm baffled by that sometimes. Aubrey had a tremendous year last year. This was winning all of our. We had it as a check in our advanced yield trials. Did exceptionally well. It has good moderate resistance to scab too. So, I'm certain it's directly related to the severity of the winter that we had. Not this last winter, but the previous winter. And so, that said, all the varieties that are moving through our program have exceptional. I lost half the lines in my advanced yield trial the first year because of the winter, but that's okay. I mean, that makes my job easier, right? So anyway, Old Standby, Red Ruby, very stable yield potential, good maturity. I'm a fan of Red Ruby. I have a lot of Red Ruby in our pedigrees in the breeding program now. So yeah, feel free to shoot me any questions at any time here. So here's the Ambassador. This is sort of our flagship variety, recent release, fairly high yield potential.
What's high yield?
Yeah. This will respond 30 bushels. So Ambassador will hit. I believe it's 88 bushels in the literature we have here. Yeah, 87 bushels. So this is, but that's under that's under conventional conditions. That's without the additional fungicide. So Ambassador is another one that will actually see about 30 bushel increase with the management. So there are some varieties that you can, and wheat in general responds very well to management practices. So, but Ambassador is one I would say that requires intensive management practices. It does have higher yield potential, but it is moderately susceptible to some of those lower canopy fungal diseases. So that's where an early fungicide application would definitely benefit Ambassador. And as you can see in the scab data, the DON and the infection data, it does require a fungicide. It does. Even if wheat is $5, it's going to be worth even less if you don't put a fungicide on it. I really have to stress that about some of these varieties. So, and that gets back to the interaction, variety by management interaction. So, Red Devil has been coming on, stable, really high yield potential. Don't have too much more to say about it. I know that it's in our trials, and I know it's out there. It's a pretty good yielder. From the breeding program here. Oh, but first, here's AC Mountain. This is an older variety, very, very high yield potential. I don't want to skip that. And I think part of it is a good disease resistance package. We use it as a check in our nurseries. Very good resistance to Staganospora and Septoria. And it really fills out a lot of biomass there. So I think a lot of that biomass accumulation translates into higher yield. But again, that's one of those varieties. It's 37 inches tall, so you have to be careful. So to really push the yield potential on something like AC Mountain, it would require a growth regulator. There are a lot of other interactions that go into plant height. You know, how much has it rained? You know, under drier conditions, plant varieties tend to remain short, but that's not usually a problem in Michigan. So you definitely, if you have early planting date and optimum fertility, you can get good yields, but you know there is risk of lodging. That's why I put that on the table. Yes.
Question right
Yes, sir.
What's your have you messed with row width?
Not personally, but Ohio State has.
Okay.
And a 15, actually wider to intercrop soybeans and wheat.
Okay, I'm talking narrower though.
Right. I haven't
push the yield
personally.
potential.
Some varieties, so yes, and that is an open area. The very last variety down there, I hope you get to it. There's a difference in how much these varieties fill out those rows. Some varieties grow up, straight up, and some grow out and fill out the rows. So there will definitely be an interaction between variety and row spacing like that. And that variety in particular, you can have a look at it down there. It actually, the leaves are more upright, actually. So
What is the population of these trials?
these are pretty standard. I believe they're 1.5. So they are 2. We did go 2 because we were planting a bit late here, actually.
When were you planting? You said you planted
This
late.
was the 3rd week of October out here,
Oh, kinda
actually.
late.
Some moderately late, yeah. And we'll see a gradient. We actually the water moves this way, so you can see the ponding down there. So, but that gets into why we replicate across the field too.
Where are you going to get this big yield you're talking? The heads are all so short, there ain't that many rows.
Yeah, I wonder about this one. Actually, I've been asking myself that question for 2 years now about it. I'm about AC Mountain.
All of them, they're all short heads.
Yeah. Come on over. 2029R. This is our one of our newest reds here. Does have a bit larger spike actually. That's kind of one of its distinguishing features. Is a little bit larger. So that's yeah. You can have a couple different ways. You can have fewer very large spikes, or you could have many smaller spikes. So there's a trade-off. So that plant is going to be as productive as it can given a finite amount of resources. So if it has a larger spike, it has to dedicate more resources to filling out that spike. So yeah, in these plots, we're definitely seeing some waterlogging issues down here in this end here, and that's exactly why we replicate these. So we have five locations times 4 reps per location. Is that each variety is tested in 20 different observations across the state to actually get a true look at the yield potential.
Eric, when you're breeding for scab resistance,
Yes.
wait, is it just the nature of the variety itself, or is there certain characteristics of the place about it that make it more
Right.
resistant?
So some people claim that a taller variety will be more scab resistant just because it evades that splashing and the movement of those spores from the ground level. AC Mountain kind of negates that a little bit. It's genetic. There are certain genes carried within a variety that confer resistance to scab. So there's a genetic basis to it actually, and on the variety side it's purely genetic. So there are a few genes out there, and that's the product of 20 years of research from the U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative. That I can tell you that E6012 has a resistance gene on chromosome 5A that's contributing to that Don resistance. And our the upright type that I mentioned on the end there, F1014, has a resistance gene on chromosome 3B that reduces the severity, the level of infection. So when that fungus lands on a floret there, it stays there. It doesn't move throughout the spike. So mainly genetic. But yes, sir.
What about awns? Do you see any difference with Don levels with awns, with or without?
No.
Don't see
No,
any difference
that
at all?
they're
You think that would hold water more?
right, or act as sort of a trap, a
Yeah.
catch for
You
spores.
don't think it makes any difference?
No. Where awns come into play is under stressful conditions later in the season. If there's a little bit of photosynthesis that goes on in those awns, so those awns stay greener than the rest of the spike, so they can actually put in maybe an extra half bushel, right at the end of maturity. So yes. So that's how they're beneficial. Now there's debate on whether they're desirable, but they can be beneficial.
How much nitrogen?
This is actually a higher rate. So there's 90 pounds of urea that went on early in the season, and there was, I believe, 35 pounds, 28% that went on with streamers later on. So they are pushed to their limits here. They don't look that good because of the, again, environment. The part of the field there's some waterlogging, but they really have responded well. The canopy on some of these have filled out exceptionally well. Like, I'm very impressed with 2029R on how well it fills out the canopy. So there's a lot of talk. There is some benefit to maintaining green foliage in the canopy. There's a lot of nitrogen that gets sequestered in the lower canopy that moves into the grain, and there's also carbon capture that goes on there that moves later on. So that research has really been advancing in probably the last 6 years. Yes, sir.
So where is your focus on breeding? Are you looking at shorter straw to push more nitrogen to push more yield? Or are you looking at taller straw for straw farmer? Where's your focus? If we're going to get to 150 bushel,
I would have
shorter?
a short plant stature, a shorter plant stature that fills out the canopy very well, that has resistance to those, to maintain the lower canopy, resistance to fungal disease, and resistance to scab.
And that's the direction you guys are going with your.
Yeah, yeah.
Focus.
Well, and Rick Ward, two breeders ago, definitely these are the product of his selection, and that you can definitely see that trademark. And you can see all the lines from Virginia Tech are that way. You see Shirley, and this year there's Virginia 106 and Virginia 108. I expect to see very, very high yields from those this year. They're very short, compact plant stature. That said, if you do push nitrogen rates on those, they will get taller. So you really need that short stature to compensate for those additional inputs. That's the variety by management interaction that exists there, and scab resistance too. That has to be there. And every single variety that we release, we've run them through the gauntlet in the scab nursery here, and made tens of observations on those every year. We get a lot of observations. So.
Are you doing anything with growth regulators?
Not personally. No, my tendency would be to just select a shorter variety in the 30 to 33 inch range, rather than selecting a taller variety. That said, if a variety is adequately adapted, and you are the only ones that know what the best varieties are for your farm, and if you find that a taller variety does perform well best on your farm, then yeah, a growth regulator would be required to bring the plant stature down and maintain those yields.
I keep hearing the 30 bushel under high intensity management.
Yeah.
Is that pretty standard across all of the varieties, or are there some of them that just won't respond to that?
That is a question I am dying to know. I would love to understand the genetics of that better, and as a research community, wheat researchers, that is a major question out there. Some do perform better, yes, it exists, but there's so much variation that it's very difficult to determine that.
So if you find one on your farm that does the 30 bushel response, stick with it.
Exactly. And try out other varieties. Don't be afraid of that. I know there are varieties that are very consistent, but holding on to that, you might lose out on something that's on the next level, that next yield plateau.